This is Matthew Cratter from Trader University, and today I want to answer the question, is Bitcoin a Chinese financial weapon? It looks like this story is the leading story on Bloomberg this morning. Peter Thiel, the headline at least is Peter Thiel calling Bitcoin a Chinese financial weapon at this virtual roundtable, Richard Nixon Institute roundtable. Now, I should say, by way of disclaimer at the beginning, that I know Peter very well. I went to school with him. I was one of the early employees at his hedge fund, Clarium Capital. And what follows, I haven't discussed this latest news with Peter, so this is obviously purely my speculation. But I know Peter pretty well, and so I think I can add something to this discussion about what appears really to be a reversal. The original headline was Thiel scorns Bitcoin as a Chinese financial weapon in an about face. Max Chafkin, he's a terrible reporter, I have to say, and this is very clickbaity. This is really taking Peter's comments out of context as well. Now, to rewind and by way of context, you can go back and listen to the CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies, interview with Peter from a couple, maybe about a month ago. And in this, he talks about what his favorite investment is for the coming decade. And not surprisingly, the quote he says is, "The one asset that I most strongly believe in, ... He goes in and talks a little bit about the FANG stocks, how they were what he calls a stupid investment, where you could just put your money in them for 10 years and not have to do anything and make 8 times your money. He thinks Bitcoin is similar for the next decade. My one candidate for the one investment that is so big and so stupid is just to buy Bitcoin." Peter held Bitcoin at least as late as 2018. There were Bloomberg stories about this. This is all public. And given Peter's libertarian background and his role as a co-founder of PayPal, he obviously has spent a lot of time thinking about currencies. PayPal was originally marketed behind the scenes as the new world currency. So Peter understands currencies and store of value very well. And he's been very bullish on Bitcoin for the last 11 years, which makes these kind of stories very surprising. When I saw this, I could barely believe my eyes. But then what you have to do in all of these cases, because you cannot trust journalists these days, journalists on the left and on the right are pretty terrible, you have to go back in and really listen to the seminar. So here's a transcript of the seminar. I haven't listened to the entire thing, but I have listened to the immediate context. And this is the immediate context. This is a transcription from that same roundtable that Max Chafkin is quoting from. China doesn't like the U.S., so these are Peter's words in this transcript. China doesn't like the U.S. having this reserve currency because it gives us a lot of leverage over oil supply chains, etc. He goes on to say that I think the euro, you can think of it as a Chinese weapon against the dollar. And this sort of shows the kind of metaphors he's using. Peter obviously does not believe that the Chinese Communist Party developed the euro in the late 90s and is using it as a weapon against the dollar. This is absurd to think. But what he is saying is that China would like to see maybe a couple reserve currencies, would like to see the U.S. dollars as world reserve currency weakened. And as he says, China would have liked to see 2 reserve currencies, including the U.S. dollar and the euro. And then here's really the quote that everyone's talking about. And even though I'm sort of a pro-crypto, pro-Bitcoin maximalist person, it's hard to know what this means, being pro-crypto and pro-Bitcoin maximalist. I believe that Peter did fund Vitalik Buterin, gave him a scholarship as part of his dropout of college program. So this may be sort of a nod in that direction. That being said, the way Peter talks about Bitcoin is definitely like a maximalist. But here's the quote. "I do wonder whether at this point Bitcoin should be thought in part of as a Chinese financial weapon against the U.S., where it threatens fiat money, but it especially threatens the U.S. dollar, and China wants to do things to weaken it, to weaken the U.S. dollar." And then there's a misquote here. This should say, if China's long Bitcoin, the U.S. should be asking some tougher questions about exactly how that works. I believe in this original article from Bloomberg. It says if China's long Bitcoin, and that's what I heard as well. You can go back and listen to the program. But I think what's happening here is very subtle, and it's a form of 3D or 4D chess. If you know anything about Peter, he's a very good chess player, as well as being a very good, investor, etc. But he does think in terms of chess. And the sort of 3D chess behind this, or 4D chess behind it, is that Peter approaches a lot of things from the perspective of this famous French philosopher named Rene Girard. I studied with Rene. Peter studied with Rene. Rene Girard was actually on my dissertation committee, so I knew him very well. He passed away in the early 2000s, or I should say around 2010 or so. Actually, I want to say it was 2015. Either way, he has a theory about how we imitate we take our desires from other people. This is called the Memetic Theory that Girard's very famous for, and Peter's talked about it in a lot of interviews as well, that people desire something not for its intrinsic value, but because other people desire it. So we don't just imitate other people in their mannerisms and gestures, but we also imitate them in their desires. And for example, if one guy likes one girl, it makes it more likely that his best friend may fall in love with the same girl, etc. And we see this throughout Shakespeare and Don Quixote. And Rene Girard really started off as a French literature professor, so he's very familiar with how this works in the world of fiction, but also in the world of non-fiction. And the reason this is relevant, you may wonder why I'm going off on this tangent, but the basic strategy here is, and it's a very obvious strategy, you don't need French theory to talk about it, but if you want someone to desire something, you just tell them that their biggest competitor has some of it or wants it. And so I think what's actually happening here, and if you know, this makes a lot more sense, I think, than thinking that Peter would be very pro-Bitcoin for 11 years and then would turn around and call it a weapon of the Chinese Communist Party. What's more likely is he's playing 4D chess here, and he's pointing out to everyone who's listening to this, in policy circles, in the U.S. government, at the Federal Reserve, Peter's saying China probably owns a lot of Bitcoin. And he may have some insider information on this. He may know this as a fact, that China owns Bitcoin. And as a result, the U.S. government better start buying some soon. This is what this quote says: if China's long Bitcoin, the U.S. should be asking some tougher questions about exactly how that works. So I think this is intended as a wake-up call for the U.S. government, and saying that rather than this is something that's going to outright destroy the dollar, this is something that the U.S. needs to start accumulating at the federal level, at the central bank level, if it has not done so already. Peter has talked about it in other places, and I think he knows, as people who have studied Bitcoin know, that it's extremely likely that Bitcoin is going to become the new global reserve asset, the new global settlement layer, and a very good store of value that's going to be accumulated not just by pensions and endowments, but also by central banks, sovereign wealth funds. We've already seen Singapore's Temasek begin to acquire it. And as a result, this is a wake-up call to the U.S. government saying you need to start accumulating Bitcoin. Peter would obviously like the U.S. to own more Bitcoin than China owns. And if we just step back and think about this, makes a lot of sense. Bitcoin, it is a financial weapon. It is a Trojan horse that has entered the fiat system and is in the process of completely rearranging the global financial system, first slowly and then increasingly quickly. But Bitcoin really is a financial weapon against any government that tries to devalue its currency, confiscate its citizens' savings through low interest rates and money printing and currency devaluation. And it's also a financial weapon against anyone who wants to limit the flow of your capital. You should be able to send money to anyone in the world without having to get your bank's permission or anyone else's permission. And as such, if we think about the Bitcoin as this decentralized technology that really, it doesn't work for the left, it doesn't work for the right. It is permissionless, it is censorship resistant. You can be a very bad person and use Bitcoin. You can be a very good person and use Bitcoin. It's a neutral protocol. It's a little bit like fire or the wheel. You can use these things to hurt people, or you can use these things to help people. But the bigger point here is that Bitcoin really is a bigger threat to the Chinese Communist Party than the US government. China has very strict capital flows, and they've been losing, a lot of capital has been leaking out of the system through Bitcoin as money tries to move abroad. And so it's quite clear that while Bitcoin is something that's going to be very bad for the US dollar, simply because of very bad policy decisions around the US dollar, it's a much bigger threat to China and the Chinese communist system. When you're running a completely decentralized system, a completely centralized system, I should say, like China is, any sort of decentralized technology like the internet has to be managed very closely, and Bitcoin as well. Now, I don't want this to lead to the inevitable discussion that China's going to ban Bitcoin. This is something that they're economically unlikely to do. I've talked about this in multiple videos. What's much more likely is what Peter, I believe, is alluding to here, that China has already begun to accumulate Bitcoin. And as such, the US really needs to get their act together and start playing catch up. So I think this whole headline, especially when you go back and read the transcript, is very clickbaity and very inaccurate. And I think what's actually going on here is a sort of 3D, 4D chess. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.